So it will go, Merriman said. He will have a sweet picture of the dark to attract him, as men so often do, and beside it he will set all the demands of the light, which are heavy and always will be. All the while he will be nursing his resentment of the way I might have had him give up his life without reward. You can be sure the dark makes no sign of demanding any such thing, yet. Indeed, its lords never risk demanding death, but only offer a black life. Hawken, he said softly, bleakly, liege man, how can you do what you are going to do? Will felt fear suddenly, and Merriman sensed it. No more of this, he said. It is clear already how it goes. Hawken now will be a leak in the roof, a tunnel into the cellar. And just as the dark could not touch him when he was my liege man, now that he is liege to the dark, he cannot be destroyed by the light. He will be the dark's ear in our midst, in this house that has been our stronghold. His voice was cold, accepting the inevitable. The pain was gone, though the witch girl managed to make her way in. She could have accomplished no scrap of magic without being destroyed by the light. But now, whenever Hawken calls them, the dark can attack us here and elsewhere, and the danger will grow with the years. He stood up, fingering his white ruffled cravat. There was a terrible sternness in his fierce curved profile, and the look that for a moment flared out from the lowering brows made Will's blood run thick and slow. It was a judge's face, implacable, condemning, and the doom that Hawken has brought upon himself by this act, Merriman said without expression, is a dread matter, which would make him many times wish that he might die. Will stood dazed, caught in pity and alarm. He did not ask what would happen to small, bright-eyed Hawken, who had laughed at him and helped him and been for so short a while his friend. He did not want to know. Out on the floor, the music of the second part of the dance jingled to a close, and the dancers made one another laughing courtesies. Will stood motionless and unhappy. Merriman's frozen look softened, and he reached out and turned him gently to face the center of the room. Will saw only a gap in the crowd, and with beyond it a group of musicians. As he stood there, they struck up once more Good King Wenceslas, the carol that had been playing when he first entered the room through the doors. Merrily the whole gathering joined in singing, and then the next verse came, and Merriman's deep voice was ringing out across the room, and Will realized, blinking, that the verse to come was his. He drew breath and raised his head. Sire, he lives a good league hence, underneath the mountain. And there was no moment of farewell, no moment in which he saw the 19th century vanish away, but suddenly, with no awareness of change, as he sang, he knew that time had somehow blinked, and another young voice was singing with him. The two of them so nearly simultaneous that anyone who could not see the lips moving would have sworn that it was only one boy's voice alone. Right against the forest fence, by St. Agnes' fountain. And he knew that he was standing with James and Mary and the rest, and he and James were singing together, and that the music with their voices was Paul's lone flute. He stood there in the dark entrance hall with his hands raised before his chest, holding the lighted candle, and he saw that the candle had not burned down 1 millimeter further than when he had last looked at it. They finished the carol. Miss Graythorne said, very good indeed. Nothing like Good King Wenceslas. It's always been my favorite. Will peered past his candle flame to look at her motionless form in the big carved chair. Her voice was older, harder, more toughened by the years, and so was her face, but otherwise she was just like her grandmother. Must that younger Miss Graythorne have been, or her great-grandmother? Miss Graythorne said, Huntercombe carol singers have been singing Good King Wenceslas in this house for longer than you or I can remember, you know. Well now, Paul and Robin and the rest of you, how about a little Christmas punch? The question was traditional, and so was the answer. Well, said Robin gravely. "Thank you, Miss Graythorne. Perhaps just a little." Even young Will, too, this year," said Paul. "He's 11 now, Miss Graythorne, did you know?" The housekeeper was coming forward with a tray of glittering glasses. And a great bowl of red-brown punch, and nearly every eye in the room was on Merriman, stepping up to fill the glasses, but Will's gaze was held by the strong, suddenly younger eyes of the figure in the high-backed chair. "Yes," said Miss Graythorne softly, almost absent-mindedly. "I did remember Will Stanton has had a birthday." She turned to Merriman, who was already moving toward them, and took from him the 2 glasses in his hands. "A happy birthday to you, Will Stanton. 7th son of a 7th son," said Miss Graythorne, "and success in your every quest." "Thank you, ma'am," said Will, wondering, and they held up their glasses solemnly to one another and drank, just as the Stanton children did for their Christmas toast, on the one day of the year when they were all allowed wine at dinner. Merriman was moving round, and now everyone had a glass of punch and was sipping contentedly. The Manor's Christmas punch was always delicious, though no one had ever quite worked out what went into it. As the senior members of the family, the twins strolled dutifully across to chat with Miss Graythorne. Barbara and Mary, in tow, made a beeline for Miss Hampton, the housekeeper, and Annie, the maid, both reluctant members of a village drama group she was trying to force into life. Merriman said to James, "You and your little brother sing very well." James beamed. Though plumper, he was no taller than Will, and it was not often that a stranger gratified him by recognizing him as a superior older brother. "We sing in a school choir," he said, "and solos and arts festivals. Even one in London last year. The music master's very keen on art festivals." "I'm not," said Will, all those mothers glaring. Well, you were the top of your class in London," James said, "so of course they all hated you. Beating their little darlings. I was only 5th in mine," he said in matter-of-fact tones to Merriman. "Will has a better voice than me." "Oh, come off it," said Will. "Yes, you have," said James. "Yes, you have." James was a fair-minded boy. He genuinely preferred reality to daydreams. "Till we both break, at any rate. Neither of us might be any good." Merriman said absent-mindedly, "In point of fact, you will become a most accomplished tenor. Almost professional standard. Your brother's voice will be baritone, pleasant, but nothing special." "I suppose that might be possible," said James, polite but disbelieving. "Of course there's no way at all for anyone to tell yet," Will said belligerently. "But he—" and caught Merriman's dark eye and stopped. "Ah," he said, and James looked at him with astonishment. Miss Graythorne called across the room to Merriman, "Paul, would you like to see the old recorders and flutes? Take him in, would you?" Merriman inclined his head in a small bow and said casually to Will and James, "Care to come too?" "No, thank you," said James promptly. His eyes were on the far door, through which the housekeeper was advancing with another tray. "I smell Miss Hampton's mince pies." Will said, understanding, "I'd quite like to see." He moved with Merriman toward Miss Graythorne's chair, where Paul and Robin stood stiff and rather awkward, one at each side, like guardsmen. "Off with you," said Miss Graythorne briskly. "Are you going too, Will? Of course. You're another musical one I was forgetting. Quite a good little collection of instruments and stuff in there. Surprised you haven't seen them before." Lulled by the words, Will said thoughtlessly, "In the library." Miss Graythorne's sharp eyes glittered at him. "The library?" she said. "You must be mixing us up with someone else, Will. There's no library here. Once there was a small one with some most valuable books, I believe, but it burned down almost a century ago. This part of the house was struck by lightning. Did a lot of damage, they say." "Oh, dear," said Will in some confusion. "Well, this is no talk for Christmas, Miss Graythorne. I am having a hell of a time saying Miss Graythorne," Miss Graythorne said, and waved them off. Glancing back at her, she turned to Robin with a bright social smile. Will found himself wondering whether the 2 Miss Graythornes were not one after all. Merriman led him, with Paul, to a side door, and they walked through a strange, musty-smelling little passage into a high, bright room that Will did not at once recognize. It was only when he caught sight of the fireplace that he realized where he was. There was the wide hearth and the broad mantel with its square panels and carved Tudor rose emblems, but round the rest of the room the paneling was gone. The walls were instead painted flat white, and brightened here and there by some large improbable-looking seascapes done in lurid blues and greens. In the place where Will had once gone into the little library, there was no longer any door. Merriman was unlocking a tall glass-fronted cabinet that stood against the side wall. "Miss Greythorne's father was a very musical gentleman," he said, in his butler voice. "And artistic, too. He painted all these pictures on the walls over there, in the West Indies, I believe. These, though," he lifted out a small, beautiful instrument, like a recorder, black inlaid with silver, "he didn't actually play, they say. He just liked to look at them." Will was absorbed at once, peering through the old flutes and recorders, as Merriman handed them into the cupboard. Merriman handed them out of the cupboard. They were both solemn in their handling. They would put each one carefully back before taking the next one out. Will turned to study the panels round the fireplace, then jumped suddenly as he heard Merriman silently calling to him. At the same time he could hear Merriman's voice aloud speaking to Paul. It was an eerie combination. "Quickly now," said the voice in his mind. "You know where to look. Quick, while you have the chance. It is time to take the sign." "But," said Will's mind. "Go on," Merriman silently roared. Will glanced back over his shoulder. The door through which they had come was still half open, but his ears would surely warn him if anyone was coming up the passage between this room and the next. He moved soft-footed to the fireplace, reaching up, and put his hands on the paneling. Shutting his eyes for an instant, he appealed to all his new gifts and the old world from which they came. Which square panel had it been? Which carved rose? He was confused by the loss of the paneled wall all around. The mantel seemed smaller than before. Was the sign lost, bricked up somewhere behind that flat white wall? He pressed every rose that he could see round the top left-hand corner of the fireplace, but none moved even a fraction of an inch. Then, at the last moment, he noticed at the very point of the corner a large rose part, buried in plaster, jutting out of the wall that clearly had been repaired as well as altered in the last 100 years. 10 minutes, he thought wildly, since he had last seen it. Hastily, Will reached up high and pressed his thumb as hard as he could against the center of the carved flower, as if it were a bell-push. And, as he heard the soft click, he was staring into a black square hole in the wall exactly at the level of his eyes. He reached in and touched the circle of the sign of wood, and as he sighed in relief, his fingers closing round the smooth wood, he heard Paul begin to play one of the old flutes. It was a very tentative playing, a slow arpeggio first, then a hesitant run, and then, very softly and gently, Paul began playing the melody Greensleeves, and Will stood transfixed, not only by the lovely lilt of the old tune, but by the sound of the instrument itself, for though the melody was different, this was his music, his enchantment, the same eerie, faraway tone that he heard always, and that always lost, at those moments in his life that mattered most. What was the nature of the flute that his brother was playing? Was it part of the old ones, belonging to their magic? Or simply something very like, made by men? He drew his hand back from the gap in the wall, which closed instantly before he could press the rose again, and he was sliding the sign of wood into his pocket as he turned, lost and listening. And then he froze.